What does it take to replace the core data store at a company like Datadog? That's the question I asked Ian Noland, who led Datadog's migration from ElasticSearch to a new system called Husky. We get into why APM was the first product to move, how they used Kafka to run both systems in parallel, and what it means to preserve a system's bugs deliberately. Here's how they pulled it off. Welcome to the next episode of Turn Stories. I'm here with Ian Noland. I'm extremely excited to have this conversation. Ian, you've been at a ton of interesting places. You were early at AWS, you're SVP at 2 Sigma, and you ran the infrastructure platform at Datadog for a long time. We're going to talk today about Datadog's migration to their latest generation of storage platform. And I'm excited to have you on the show. So welcome.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Cool. Well, let's dive in. The latest generation storage platform, obviously, this is not a one tick effort. There had been a couple of generations. From your perspective, what was it like on the previous generation, and what were people seeing that kickstarted this need to think about a new platform?
Yeah, so there's a couple of aspects to this. So Datadog's original product, it was you'd call it infrastructure monitoring. Everyone thinks of it as metrics. Everyone, even today, who I meet will complain about the cost of Datadog's custom metrics. And what that means is a data store that can do a lot of compression on time and what they call over space, over cardinality, but wasn't great about sort of that massive cardinality data. And so that was, Datadog was very successful at that. Around about 2018. They started getting to what they now call the 3 pillars of observability. And so logs and APM are the big two. And they are the classic where you actually need high cardinality. And so the way that they built it, Datadog was a very move fast, use as much open source as you can startup. And you can imagine it was essentially, for these two products, it was Kafka, sort of as you were ingesting all the data from customers, and then a lot of sharded Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch at the time, and Elasticsearch probably even today, it's pretty good if you have a static data set in terms of size. It's pretty awful if it's consistently horizontally scaling. And that was sort of, Datadog was very successful. We were probably growing 100% year over year in terms of data volumes at this point in time. And so the teams that owned, the APMs and logs team, were in massive pain caused by essentially Elasticsearch operations. And so that's what it looked like. The other thing that was becoming clear at Datadog at this point is, as the 3 pillars were succeeding, we sort of, we're now 5 years later, there was this clear desire to build it like 20 more products. And most of those products were going to be a lot more like logs and APM than they were going to be like metrics. And so it was very clear that we needed to do something about the core data store. And so that was sort of what led to this idea. Okay, what do we end up migrating? How do we migrate and what to?
Makes sense. So you had engineers in pain, being woken up at all hours. You had this like strategic need to go to 20 different products. So where did the idea come from? How did you come up with, let's build a whole new system instead of evolving the new one? And what were like the core tenets of that system?
Yeah, it was interesting in that, so this was a 3-year migration end to end. And for the first 12 months, actually, this was not under me. I was a VP of engineering, and actually APM was under another VP of engineering, and logs was under another VP of engineering. And like all sort of engineering teams, like our tendency was to want to incrementally improve what we had beneath us and not necessarily cooperate across the 3 different VPs. And you get into like, why is that a problem? For us, it was particularly, it was hard to hire great back-end storage engineers, and we're sort of competing for it. So I'll give full credit. This wasn't actually my idea. It was the VP of logs had come in from an acquisition and he'd been thinking about the general case of problem for a long time. And he just so it's this general observation. And I think at this point, everyone in the industry knows it, which is, especially for observability data, where like 90% of written data is never read, Elasticsearch is a really bad way of implementing that, actually, because it's indexing everything as it's sort of being ingested. And so particularly with this push, especially with logs, right, to, commoditize, why are you paying anything more than what it costs us to write that 90% on top of S3? It became very, very clear, sort of circa 2018, that the right architecture was a column store on S3, sort of what everyone in this space has today. And so this sort of came from him. And I think the further thing that he sort of realized is that like I have to find a way of marketing this platform. Like, so, that he had to change the logs product storage into an event platform. And I had to change it in a way where I get the momentum internally that new products will bet on me rather than just stand up new thing one after another. And so it's sort of this realization. I think you'd say much better architecture for what needs to be stored, but also better strategic thinking that we just can't have each product continually reinventing the wheel. We need to start consolidating on a platform. And so that was all him. Full credit to him, sort of seeing it and convincing me at the time. I was like a lot of people. I was just focusing on my own problems that the metric team was having undergrowth.
Gotcha. I think that's so typical of so many organizations is that you've got your thing that you're trying to do.
That's what engineers, we silo very well, and it takes good people to sort of see bigger than the silos.
So what convinced you? Was there something in it for you, or did he appeal to your better nature or something else?
I think it was better nature. So I have a strong engineering background, and so like the idea of a big architecture and thinking big, like that was probably the Amazon time had like really put that in my mind, and so I think it was seeing that. I think he sold the vision well, and I was the type of leader who understood that vision very well. Actually, so in many ways, like this was a cost for me. Eventually, this team would move on to me, right? And so things would change. But actually, this was a cost for me. I had to give up good candidates to this team. I actually had to convince my teams on legacy that like they would be served by this eventually, but like I can't actually start them up now. So it was a net cost. So no, it was appealing to my better nature. I think Datadog in general, honestly, has a good culture about that type of decision. It's one of the things having co-founders who are technical is they get that type of more strategic thinking.
Yeah, that makes sense. That there's a ton. I mean, that you can only do so many things at once, and especially for these big migrations, you end up swallowing, one strategic effort per N engineers, and that's all you can support.
Exactly.
What was some of the stuff that you had to give up in order to make this happen?
So I think the biggest was sort of what I said, like strictly it was candidates. Like I remember a guy called George Talbot, he's still here in New York, a great engineer, but I went out of my way personally to recruit him for the metrics team. Like, I sort of did. And then it was like, a month before I think it was maybe 2 weeks before he was due to start, Emmanuel, who had owned this effort, sort of said, like, Ian, like, this is the more strategic offering. You need to give him up. And, it was tough. Like, personally, it's easy as a VP to think bigger for the company. But I then had to convince my director, hey, I've got this great engineer who could help you on your problems today. It is more important for the company that he goes work on this strategic effort. And it's that type of thing that is tough. And so
that's a hard conversation.
Yeah, it is. Again, what you hope as a leader is you've built up enough goodwill that you can occasionally do that and argue that it's strategic for the company, and you'll keep the trust of the leader, you'll keep the trust of the team, and that's what I sort of saw as my role. I think at that time it actually worked okay. I've had it not work at other times in my life, but no, that was sort of the hardest thing. Is like the teams who are more on fire with incremental problems don't get the engineers that they need because you have to sort of staff up. This is a key thing with this. It was sort of done as a tiger team. So it was staffed up sort of completely independently of current problems.
Yeah. And that can be hard to hear on teams that are underwater on fire.
Exactly.
Okay. So you had a visionary VP that convinced you and a bunch of other people. You knew what you needed to do. You'd staffed up. So walk me through the major milestones. How did you actually think about getting this done?
Yes. So Datadog, when they started it, it had just those two initial products, but they were already at the point, I think they'd had the synthetics product, the network monitoring products. They had these two whale products to migrate, and then they were starting to see like these tiny products start to build up. And that list would be about 20 products by the time it was done. So I think it was a classic when they started it. It was like, oh, we'll be done in 12 months. It actually took 3 years, as these things did. The very wise thing they did, though, was just focus on one product to start with. And so it was interesting. This is part of the other two VPs. So you had the VP of APM. He'd hired actually two great engineers who were very, very, very deep, had built this type of system in past lives. He had to actually give them up to the logs team, which was the better overall architecture for the long term. So he gave them up, but then the quid pro quo was APM was prioritized as the number one product. And so really for the first 18 months, this isn't quite true, but really for the first 18 months of this 3-year migration, they just purely focused on APM. APM was the one that was probably as a product, there was Dynatrace out there. There was good competitive reasons to make APM more stable, have better performing queries as fast as possible. So it was a good win-win. And so that was sort of the first 18 months. The next 6 to 12 was logs. And then those small ones was the tail, essentially.
That's really interesting that you ended up with APM. I love that you picked a specific product and said, like, that's the use case that we're going to drive this like technical migration around. And of course, I have a soft spot for APM, being of like, we worked in it at the same time that Datadog was absolutely crushing it in the early days. It's how do you think about that balance between APM as the strategic bet, and what was the thinking behind saying like that's going to become the strategic focus of the company, even though maybe logs and metrics are the bigger businesses, the bigger technical use cases, the bigger data sets that maybe need this?
Yeah, and so there's a couple of like this is like I think good VP level decision making, right? Is you often you're thinking sort of product strategic and engineering strategic, and when you can bring the right answer for those two things together, you've made a good decision. So the product strategic is, while APM was smaller, it was growing aggressively. We'd hired some really good ex-Java people, I think, to like really make the APM for Java really, really good. And so there was a sense that, yeah, APM was a smaller business today, but if we invested in it the right way, it was going to be just as big as logs in metrics. So there was really good sense that that APM had just as much, TAM, I guess, total market there. On the engineering side, the nice thing about APM, so logs is really, because logs gets used for security use cases, they care a lot about deduplication and data loss. Whereas APM in general, they've got used to sampling, they've got used to, you can be a little bit more lossy. So in terms of engineering features, it actually required the least amount of features to ship. And so it's one of those things that made sense from an engineering perspective, and it made sense from a business perspective. So it wasn't a hard argument to argue for. Once APM was shipped, though, then you get well, how come you can't ship logs yesterday? so after you see the success, you sort of see the consequences of the decision. But I think it was a pretty easy decision.
You've got one product. We have 20 we want on this.
Yeah.
Why are you not done?
Exactly. That's exactly it. No, you've been working on this for 2 years, and why does it take so long? It's a classic. Everyone outside gets very impatient, especially once they've seen the initial success. But it was good that it wasn't a knife fight over which was the right product.
Cool. Okay, so you've got APM. You've picked it. APM wasn't built on. This wasn't like greenfield, right? Like APM had already existed, and it needed its own little migration to move over too. So how did you tackle that?
Yes. So again, this is purely my peer. So he had a really good idea in terms of how to make this migration happen. So the way that all of these stuff was like each team would cobble together their own self-managed Kafka, their own self-managed Elasticsearch, and then there was always some amount of live data that Elasticsearch sucked on, and you were sort of caching / materializing stuff. And so APM had all that. What my peers sort of realized with his product manager was if we can make the Kafka management really, really easy for product teams, then we can sort of take over the ingestion, and they will stop caring actually about the data store at that point. Like, so we can, by thinking about the ingest problem and making it very, very easy for the product engineers to sort of manage Kafka or whatever, that also allows us to like take over the storage problem. And so that was actually the first, if you look at what they actually built in the first 6 months, before they wrote a line of code for the new data store, it was all around Kafka management. And it was all around basically getting that problem, I guess in terms of, the book I sort of wrote on Platform Engineering, they were raising the abstraction around ingestion, so that at that point they could completely swap out the back end without the product teams caring. And so that was really, once they'd done that, with essentially the APM team being the pilot customer for that became their pattern for how they could just get teams on their platform and completely strip out what was happening underneath with almost full control. Of course, not totally full control, but almost full control on the software side.
That makes a ton of sense. There's this interesting parallel where I talked to someone a few weeks ago on the show about how they did a front end migration in the same way. And there was the similar problem of like, if we could wave a magic wand and make the change, like that's not the end state we want, because if you don't raise the abstraction barrier, you still have a bunch of people who have to know the new system. And like, did you ever talk with them? Did you ever tell them how they were going to operate this? Did you tell them how to debug it and how to build on it? Because they've got efforts. So yeah, you have to make this choice. You either get people spun up on the new system and excited about it and read in, or probably much more appealing to folks who are being woken up at 3 a.m, you just take the problem away from them.
Exactly.
So what was hard about that? Because if I'm a product team, that sounds amazing.
I think it was so. If you imagine how the ingestion works for Datadog, you end up with like a lot of sort of sharding decisions and sort of queue management problems. And so the initial, like especially when you're in that fast moving phase, every team comes up with their own semantics. So you end up with like every team has slightly different semantics that are exactly right for their product, but actually very, very hard to abstract across. And so I actually think the hardest aspect of it was the product management aspect, which was essentially like, okay, take a dead letter queue, right? Okay, we tried this thing. If we try and consume it, breaks the storage engine. We can't throw it away, but it's just got to sit in this dead letter queue until we can page an engineer to look at it. So something like an idea like that, it's just like coming up with the right design of it that you end up making these 4 different product teams happy, such that that they're happy to sort of hand you the pager at the end of the day. So I think it's just these little decisions. It's just the usual abstracting across something that's in production, where you are asking the product team to sometimes walk back a little bit of what they're comfortable with today to something that you can support over way more use cases. So very much, I think much less a technical problem than I think a product definition problem.
Yeah, every migration is just like 100 migrations in a trench coat.
It's how much work you put on the product team and how much can you actually internalize it. And there's, as much as you should try and internalize as much as possible. Sometimes they do have to make changes, and you have to manage that relationship well to get them to make those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this iterative process that's happening where you're almost thinking. I was going to ask you about testing, but you've almost answered that question of like you're working with the product team to understand what is their sense of correctness.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's all well and good, and it's lovely to work at a place where you can work with people, hand in glove. But Datadog's a real business, and people rely on that. How do you think about deploying and merging those changes in a way that doesn't break the existing workflows of important customers?
So I think there's 2 sides. I think there's the one that like engineers, maybe find more attractive, and like the managers. So like on the Kafka, I think it was just very, very careful ops, honestly. Like so once they migrated the Kafka over, and then they were operating Elasticsearch the same way. So like there was no worries. Like what you worry about with storage systems are, are you consuming everything, and then are your queries performing correctly, and are they giving the right answers, and are they performing well enough? And so the Kafka stuff, I think, was mostly just fine-grained management. But then they actually had the actual Husky system, the thing that was replacing Elasticsearch. And there, like, the team spent a lot of time on shadow, what that calls shadow ingestion, right? So basically, you are literally forking off the back of Kafka and writing everything to your legacy store Elasticsearch and your new store Husky. And then they had to write a query comparison system. So this thing that would send queries to both systems and look at the results in terms of both performance and correctness, and make sure that the same things are getting there. And so that was a lot of investment in sort of bespoke tooling to essentially ensure that that the same results are being there. Like the truth, like the classic with Datadog is like, false positives are just as bad as false negatives. So if the newer system did something more correct, but actually led to a real customer getting paged at 2:00 in the morning, that's actually just as bad as it being incorrect. And so they had to spend a lot of time really analyzing those results. And so, this was actually true of my time at Amazon as well. Like progressive deployments and shadow deployments were the main 2 tools that they allowed the team to get this right.
Absolutely. And Kafka is such a tricky one as well, because it's not like the complexity is in the code that you can run locally. Like this is an operations problem, and all of the problems are going to happen in production.
Yeah.
I've one of the investors in turn was in your seat at a similar company, and we would trade text messages that were just Kafka and like a series of swears
Yeah.
because every time you push something into production, there's this open question of like, how careful were we? Do we have the right tooling in place? Do we know that this thing is going to work? And, hopefully you've been looking at shadow traffic for a month, because if not, you've got no prayer that this thing is going to work.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got a bunch of good answers to this, but I want to know your answers. Weirdest edge case as you were doing this.
I think the weirdest edge case I probably just mentioned, but I think the weirdest edge cases were just Elasticsearch, where you find out Elasticsearch, especially when you're like doing these aggregate queries over a time series, which Elasticsearch was never really built for time series. It's just people learned that they could shove time series in there. So it was just Elasticsearch giving the wrong answers, and you as an engineering team having to say, well, actually, we're gonna. The Datadog answer is essentially the Elasticsearch answer from 2018 forever, because we cannot, we cannot as a business, deploy something where a bunch of our existing customers get a bunch of false alarms, and so the Elasticsearch semantics became the correct semantics. So I think that was the interesting edge cases. It was just those, when you have to say to an engineering team, it actually doesn't matter what is fully correct mathematically. What matters is what matters is what Elasticsearch does, and
this decision was made in 2015.
Yeah, exactly. And that's it. Lucene is older than that, right? So it's probably made in Lucene in 2008, and we live with it.
Amazing. Those decisions will live forever. Yeah. Cool. So you had an approach, especially to getting APM moved over. How did you? I mean, that's not a trivial approach. How did you lather, rinse, repeat that across the other 2 major services and 17 subsequent services?
So I think logs was a big heavy, anytime you have a big product where you're talking about hundreds of millions of revenue, and also logs was significantly different, particularly in the never wanting to lose a log message, never wanting to double write a log message was a big thing with logs. So I'd say that looked a lot, honestly. So number 2 looked a lot like number 1. Like, it was fairly hand managed, a lot of individual attention to detail. I'd say the nice thing that happened, and this is I think every true success, is during this time period, you could say there was a lot of Husky native new products started. So there's probably 5 products that never ran on Elasticsearch. They were just they didn't need any new features, and they could just use the new system Husky from day one. And so that was just very, very nice. That was almost like a pain-free migration.
That's the dream.
Yeah, that's the dream. And the nice thing about them is they were small and they were young products where, look, if you end up having a bug that some query times out, but it's completely new. So this is new behavior. It's not a change in expectations. And so they got a lot of their growth, a lot of that growth in terms of broadness, just out of these new products that were being launched. I'd say the what was it? Probably the 5 or so network monitoring. I think it was process monitoring, the actual old events thing. They'd built enough sort of tooling at the lift and shift stage. So that was fairly automated at that point in time. I still felt like it was only one at a time, and each took a month. I'd say at this scale of migration where it's tilde 20, lots of human eyes. It was never that fully automated. We just roll it out and it just works. But it did, after logs, it got a lot faster than, it was, I think strictly it was 12 months to be fully done, but it was 6 months to get it handling 80% of traffic for logs. And the rest were mostly much faster than that.
And it's interesting that you say that you're driving internally with the amount of traffic you moved over, that you could do it incrementally.
Yeah. Again, this is part of a joy. For all of it, we hate Kafka. The nice thing about having those queues in ingestion is that the thing behind it can be very selective in how much that it handles. So it was very easy to just feature flag customers into it and see the results, right? So yeah, the nice thing about this async, you're paying for this extra copy of the data. The nice thing about it is it does give the engineering team and the product team a lot of freedom to make the migration nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And moving over customer by customer is just so conceptually clean. That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
So then That's great that you move logs and everything else, like the dominoes just fell because you tackled all the hard problems basically.
Mostly, although there's the big caveat to this. So if you are a Datadog customer and you've been a Datadog customer for a while, like Datadog's always had this event view, which sort of dates back to syslog, dates back to 2013 when Datadog was a pure infrastructure monitoring. So the last migration was actually that. And the big thing is they needed a feature where they could actually annotate log lines. And that was a feature that no other customer, no other internal customer, no other Datadog product needed. And so convincing actually the product managers, but even just the event platform team, hey, we need to finish the migration. Like we are not a shitty engineering shop that gets 95% done and leaves like one poor team like in hell, essentially operating their own Elasticsearch cluster that just because of this one feature. And so that last one, again, it was non-trivial technically, actually, to do that. But it was more, and this is probably my role as VP, it was more just convincing everyone, like, we will all like ourselves better if we actually complete the migration. And that was sort of, and I as VP will recognize this effort, even if the business is like, hey, you should have put this engineering on some new product that is sexier, which is what you always hear as a leader. Like, we need to clean up our architecture. We need to get this migration done. And so, yeah, it turned out to just be one feature, but a non-trivial feature. And then just like, oh, everyone's like, oh, this thing doesn't really matter, does it? And it's like, no, it completely matters, right? It is still a part of our product. It's not that well used, but we can't kill it in the product. So yeah, it's that classic, like that last little hump in that migration, just willing it to get done. That was more difficult than you would think. But it's just like, because there's always other stuff the engineers could be doing, right? And so it's convincing everyone this will be worth it.
Yeah, and there's the motivation shifts at that point. It sounds
exactly.
like
exactly. Everyone gets, especially once you get that new thing you put out and you can start putting new capabilities on it. Everyone just wants to unlock all the new capabilities, and it's like, no, we've got to finish the migration. And let's be disciplined. Again, nice thing about Datadog having engineering co-founders is they get it, but even them, like, you need defense being played at almost every level of your hierarchy to actually, to make this happen.
Yeah, and I'm actually a big proponent of not finishing migrations if everyone's aligned on that, because it's fine, like no big deal. But it's a great point that if you get close enough, if you've done 60% and everyone kind of loses interest and there's no value, you're like, yeah, stop doing work. But if you've done 99% of the migration, that win is worth it, even if you're not going to see it show up in revenue metrics. It's just great for morale.
Yeah, and I think it depends a little bit on the migration. Like I definitely would agree with you for something that isn't leaving significant infrastructure that is customer facing. Essentially, what it was destining one team to be was ops hell forever, or like ops hell for 5 years until maybe it got built. And like that's bad for the team, bad for the customers. And so it was easier to justify in terms of this is right for the business to kill. Whereas, yeah, there's other migrations where it's just like cleanliness. And I think we've, you and I both said, right? Like there will be another migration 4 years from now. Why not just wait for it? And so I agree with you in those circumstances that sometimes you can be too pure.
Yeah, but that's part of the job. It's figuring out when do you go to 100% and where can you pause it? Where can you wait for the next one?
Yeah,
for sure. What sort of, speaking of that, like not trying to leave teams in ops hell, and you had a bunch of double infrastructure running, what kind of cleanup did you see? And how long did this migration go past the point of declaring victory?
I think because of the fact that they had built those, again, it's maybe the joy of Kafka, that like because they built those incremental tooling to like fail across very early, it wasn't so much like the usual, just, shutting down, I think we've both seen, right? Like sometimes shutting down infrastructure, particularly like it just takes years sometimes. Actually our migration from VMs to Kubernetes was exactly like that. Like literally took a lot of time. In this case, actually, it wasn't too bad. Like it was, once it could support 100% of queries for 100% of customers, and we were confident that we weren't losing data, it didn't have that long tail of cleanup that some migrations have. So yeah, it was a nice thing. I think the nature of the system itself meant the tooling was built up front as opposed to like that last 20% cleanup automation type stuff. So yeah, wasn't it took a long time because a lot had to be built, but it didn't take a long time because there was a lot of cleanup. That was the nice thing about this migration.
Cool. So you're actually prioritizing going through and doing that cleanup as you went, so you didn't leave yourself with like the debt of the debt.
Exactly.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the human side of this migration. How did sort of the originating team, which is I guess originally under this other VP but eventually came under you, like how did they feel about the migration, and how did that change over the 3 years that you went through this?
Yes, so there's some interesting, like, really human dynamic in this. So the VP I mentioned, he'd come in as part of an acquisition. He'd always had this vision. He'd sold this vision a lot. And so what's interesting is that you had this team, this logs team, that was completely pained by just the growth in logs, but very, very ambitious, actually. They're an ambitious team to want to take on more. And so to an extent that taking on the migration cost was part of this vision of doing an event, like getting out of a logs platform. Let's be the event platform. I think the VP and the director sold that very, very well to the team. So it was a team, working incredibly hard. Like honestly, this is sort of well known now, but like it was a burnout factory. Like most engineers would only last about 18 months on the team before the 60-hour weeks. The team was also in France, so dealing with like issues on US time was super painful. It was into their evenings, into their nights. So it was interesting. It was a team that was very, because they believed in the mission so much. Like the migration was like the fact that this was a difficult migration, they're totally on board with. Like it wasn't one of those ones we've probably both seen, right, where the platform team itself doesn't really want to do the migration. This was the opposite. They really wanted to do the migration because it matched their mission, and they had leaders who got good alignment of the engineers in that mission. So yeah, it wasn't. Definitely, I've seen much harder migrations in terms of selling into the team.
That's interesting. And you mentioned this earlier, is that this transition from like logging to event-driven platform is not a Datadog specific idea, that there was this industry motion. I'm not sure. I'm sure that there's some listeners who haven't, worked in observability for 10 years. Tell me a little bit more about like what was happening more broadly that influenced the team to be so excited about that kind of change.
I think it was just Datadog was at this point in observability, sort of circa 2018, I think is when this acquisition happened. So like a year before I actually even started. I think it was really when monitoring became observability in a way. So I think it was this incredible excitement at the time around the breadth of things you can do with observability, and how much the nice thing about Datadog in general, right? VPs complain about it because how expensive it is. Engineers tend to love it. And so engineers working on Datadog love working at Datadog because their colleagues who don't work at Datadog love Datadog, right? And so I think honestly, but if you pull it apart, I think it was just this excitement around what you can do with observability. And so like, an event platform is essentially just a time series structured log. Like it's just that recognition. And so I think it's that team just fully believed that, and maybe a little bit too much actually. This comes back to where it doesn't actually fit metrics that well, but they just believe that all of observability's problems can be solved with this one platform. I mean, if you look at Honeycomb's marketing today, we sort of have the same marketing. Everything can be solved with Honeycomb. A lot of problems can actually be solved with this approach. And so I think it was just that excitement at the time around that approach.
With this platform and enough money,
exactly,
anything can happen.
Yeah, and essentially, you would probably like building because in the end they all end up building a fully functional distributed database that can handle SQL, and like that's 100 developer years. So it does take a lot of investment for these things to actually hit their initial vision.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So yeah, you had that team that was bought in on it. Did that excitement like spread to other teams being on the other side of the fence?
I don't think so. I think so an interesting thing that this started with, but definitely I continued, is there actually wasn't a TPM on this project for the first 2 of the 3 years. We did have a TPM for the last year, but we didn't have a TPM. What we did have though was a full-time product manager, and that product manager who was part of this acquisition had come in very, very much believed in the vision. He was a very, very good person at selling the vision, and particularly coming up with compromises that would convince other products that, hey, it's much better for you to get on us and to be part of the migration with us than doing it yourself independently. And a lot of what that looked like was actually just compliance stuff. So like HIPAA and PCI DSS, right? No product team wants to be bothered by those things. And so it's like, hey, we're going to be the ones, we're going to burden ourselves with the compliance stuff. And so I think I think it was just a classic, you'd say it was finding the incremental value for the business that got them excited about the platform and the platform migration. But yeah, I'd say it's like honestly in any engineering org, there was a decent amount of skepticism of the approach, and so it wasn't like it wasn't like total skepticism, but it wasn't total belief either. It was like, okay, let's wait and see, sort of from the engineers. But it was finding those business wins that actually got people excited for the migration.
That's cool. So I love the idea of having someone internally who's really focused on almost like landing that story, right? Like we're going to build an industry changing platform. We're going to align ourselves with the future. We're going to do great things for Datadog, but for you, what that's going to look like is not dealing PCI.
Yeah. Yeah, it's because I remember like it was the network monitoring product. Like there's always like beware hiring staff engineers into product teams because they will convince themselves that the platform will never be good enough. And they just need to, do something internally. And like, this wasn't a bad engineer, but like, I've just seen that mindset repeat so many times when product teams do it. And so what this product manager and the lead staff engineer did was this like negotiation over about 6 months where they did a bigger and bigger proof of concept and sort of won him over that we are actually better. And we do these compliance stuff aside. So, sort of this dance of convincing teams that, hey, when we get off Elasticsearch, you want to be on us as opposed to taking all the problems of managing open source onto yourself. So that to me is a big part of a product manager role for platform teams, is those types of delicate negotiations.
That makes sense. That feels right in my experience. How much, I think it's easy to see from inside the platform team what the selling motion looks like because you've got someone pushing the vision and getting people bought in. How did that feed back? Like it's a two-way street, I imagine, or unless you've got an exceptionally talented internal PM.
You mean, how did it feed back to the product teams?
Yeah, or how did it feed back to the platform team? And did it change the goals? Did it change the ordering? Like how did that change the plan?
I would say this was very much, so I've seen this work out differently in different migrations. This was very much the product manager, the lead staff engineer, and the two engineering managers who were there. They very much acted as the umbrella. So to some extent, there was so much work on the ground, keeping the old system running and migrating to the new team. I think the engineers were fairly protected from the actual product side of it. It definitely wasn't the Camille Fournier, my co-author of a platform, she's like, every engineer should be directly dealing with support cases because that's how you understand the customer. This wasn't that pattern at all, actually. Those four really isolated the team from having to care too much. And so really just became a roadmap timing problem that the lead product manager sort of operated for the team. So yeah, it wasn't one where the team, like the actual engineers, had to concern themselves too much about winning people over. I've definitely seen other migrations that wasn't the case, but yeah, this one had that nice property that they could just focus on building.
That's awesome, and especially if you can fix it just by like reordering what you are already going to do or reordering how the customer integrates with it. Then
the one thing I think the lead staff engineer did really, really well was every 2 weeks he wrote a summary of progress, and he was a very good writer, and so he simultaneously did this well for engineers but also engineering managers. So like it wasn't overly technical. And he simultaneously did it for both the internal team and the external team. And so it was this nice, like it was just 2 pages, but this nice 2 pages every 2 weeks that kept everyone's sense that there is momentum here. Like it just kept the outside people seeing that stuff was being worked on, and it kept the internal people who might be like on what they saw that week, they didn't see any wins, kept the internal engineers seeing the wins that were happening. And so it's just a really nice way of maintaining momentum across what was a pretty big project. 3 years is a long time when all is said and done. So I did like that. And the fact that it was an engineer doing it, but an engineer who wasn't stuck at like an engineer's level of detail, it was much better than having a TPM or a product manager do it, where all, they tend to just do like a execution story, but this was a far better story than that. And so I think that was a big part of keeping everyone aligned across the timeline.
Do you actually think it was a benefit to not have a TPM?
I think it was a benefit until that tail. So I think, yeah. So I totally, and this is actually, my co-author Camille, like in the book, like she hates TPMs early in migrations because they tend to take what is essentially a product problem and turn it into an execution problem. And thinking that if we just execute off this Gantt chart correctly, everyone will be happy. So I did think, she would say like it stretches your staff engineer to be a bit more of a TPM. Tanya Riley's book, The Staff Engineer's Path, is great. And like good staff engineers should be a little bit like a TPM. It stretches the product manager to think in terms of schedule, which some product managers don't. Now, but the long tail, even for us, with just like a 20-person tail, we absolutely need a TPM to just crunch the freaking, the trade-offs and whatever. But yeah, I do think the longer you can go without a TPM, the better. And sometimes that means telling your staff engineer and your product manager, hey, you're part-time TPMs. And, everyone can do it. Like everyone will insist they can't do it. Like, managing an Excel spreadsheet is not that hard. so they can do it, but you don't want it to become their full-time job. So you have to be sensitive to how much work it is.
The sense of colors and the width of columns in a spreadsheet is not the primary skill of a TPM. That's not what they're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
You can do that, engineer.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I entirely agree. You can't get by. You can't really finish that swing with that many pieces.
Yeah.
Unless you've got a TPM, but
yeah, and particularly like we'd get into like big, like as the project succeeded, like suddenly it started eating up a lot of the budget. So you had to play defense against the finance team, and like so these other non-technical stakeholders come in, and a good TPM is great at that. Like, but they have to be on top of the details to do that, and that has both pros and cons.
Yeah, I guess after 3 years of running double infrastructure, finance wakes up.
They do. There's like this because is it COG? I don't know. This gets into like technical terms. Like if you're doing it more for R&D, it's not COGS, and so like the finance who cares about margin doesn't care. But eventually it gets just big enough. Regardless, finance does care, and so yeah, they do wake up.
I would occasionally stare at the breakdown between like COGS and R&D and like the teams that were allocated to that at Slack, and it was like staring into the void. It's like doesn't make any sense.
I mean, accounting it's a black art.
That's like, it's right. I'm sure. I'm not an accountant. I'm going to stop looking at this spreadsheet.
Yeah.
If you had to do it again, what would you do differently?
I think. So it's interesting, especially with the first year it wasn't under me, then the 2 years it was. And I do think they did for a team that was heavily loaded, they did a really good job that first year. It's interesting. I don't really know. It's always like, the answer to that is almost like what fires come up. But then like it's always easy in hindsight, right? Like what fires came up that we should have known maybe earlier. Like what took a lot of time in logs was that correctness around only ingest once, because you don't want that security log message that says if I see 5 of these a day to go up because you only saw 4, you double wrote 1. So more maybe it was internal project timing. Those projects that should have kicked off earlier just because they became the long pole in hindsight. But like that's I feel like I'm explaining every project. Otherwise, it's always in management, right? You get into I wish we'd been able to put more engineers on it sooner. But like we were like ripping engineers away from directors with burning problems. Like it wasn't that easy to do that either. So I don't know. I think all in all, it was a fairly successful project. We the director of it left completely burnt out 2 years into it. It would have been nice to like not have the burnout happen. But yeah, that was tough because it was just the hours of Paris versus US were tough. So I don't know. I don't look back with too many regrets on this one, actually.
Yeah, that you can. I mean, with perfect hindsight, sure, you could. Yeah, you could know that you should solve on exactly once ingest, or you could throw more engineers.
Maybe honestly, it comes back to like,
at it. You're probably going to burn your director out faster too.
Yeah, it might become a little bit back to like the fact that I had to be sold by this other VP on what in hindsight was completely the right decision. It might be me, being a little like I'd only been at Datadog like 4 or 5 months, and my directors had burning problems. But yeah, it might just be like being a little bit more open to my peer VPs. When they're seeing maybe further out than I'm seeing. Because again, like Datadog metrics is still not running on this today. Like maybe in 2027, the grand unification will actually happen. But yeah, it's tough when you have this other VP say, look, I need all the headcount, and you go, well, I need headcount too. But I think he was totally right. I think it was that big vision was the right vision. So I'd say maybe in hindsight, I took that. Think a little bit bigger in your decisions. But that's less on the team and more on me personally.
And you did end up having to run it anyway, so maybe it was good that you were willing to staff it.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. That makes sense. But you're not at Datadog anymore. What's the next big thing for you?
Yes, so I left Datadog, actually more or less declared success, although I was managing 700 people at this point. So this wasn't my success, it was my team's success. So I left Datadog 2 years ago, about March 2023. I took time to write a book on platform engineering. It's a lot of sort of, the theme of this talk, sort of the management level of these types of decisions. That's sort of the book. It's very much a management book. Then about a year ago, I decided that I was, still very, very hungry. Didn't want to be an author together. So sort of co-founded Junction Labs. And what it is, across my time on sort of these migrations, it was, the Nitro stuff at AWS, Two Sigma compute platform. Two Sigma was the finance company I worked on, and then Datadog. This sort of shadow deployments and progressive deployments, like almost like continuous deployment type stuff. I always thought this was what unlocked like the big sort of big re-architectures, big migrations to get to the actual next level. And so Junction Labs is, so everything we just talked about actually used Kafka and was asynchronous. And Kafka is great if you're willing to take the cost of asynchronous messaging. But if you're in a synchronous space and you're not behind the API gateway, you don't really have a lot of answers for these types of features. And so Junction Labs is trying to build into the networking layer a lot of these capabilities around, you call it like essentially traffic shaping, traffic mirroring, dynamic traffic load balancing. And so we're sort of doing this, like the technical term that people who are in the space would know, we're a proxyless service mesh. So we're trying to do the same ideas service mesh have, but not force you into a big migration onto sidecars. Instead, we're trying to do this as a smaller migration into a drop-in library that just unlocks these capabilities that now each individual engineering team can sort of control their own fate in this way. And so that's Junction Labs. We're still seed stage. It's a couple of guys in a room at the moment, still very early. But over time, like I think, again, every successful migration I've seen has used some notion of how do we put stuff in production and learn from production, because there's no way we can simulate this in testing, integration testing at scale. So it's really the test in production idea.
Absolutely. It makes a ton of sense. And it mirrors a lot of what we're thinking about at Turn as well, is, that you can make the code changes, but nobody wants a diff. No one declares victory when GitHub has a bunch of code on it that you need to prove to yourself that it works. And that starts with unit tests, and it moves on to integration tests, and it moves out into getting it into production. And that is such a scary moment.
Yeah.
You put something into production, and anything you can do to smooth that over.
That's exactly right. It's basically like, it's not quite as meme at the moment, right? But like, I only test in production. So it's sort of that 10 years ago idea. But actually across my, 15 years doing this, like testing production is the right way, but you have to make it very, very safe, like brain dead, like where you can't, an engineer just checking something cannot shoot themselves in the foot. And so like, yeah, being able to at the networking level, just be up to like, select a test tenant ID or select 1% of traffic. These are all like, there's a system out of Twitter called Finagle in 2010. None of these techniques are new, but really they've never made it outside sort of the big shops. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do with Junction Labs.
Right on. That's awesome. Oh, we'll drop a link to Junction and to the platform engineering book in the comments. Cool. Well, we're just out of time, so a couple of quick fire questions just to wrap things up. If you could wipe one technology off the face of the planet, never existed, what would it be?
Never existed. That's honestly. So when I interviewed at Datadog, they asked me to design a system actually, and it's actually this sort of system we talked about. And I said I would not use Elasticsearch because Elasticsearch does not scale. And I was sort of skeptical because at that point they weren't having all the burning problems. But Elasticsearch, like it just was. And I know Elasticsearch themselves has sort of moved to a column store now, but like that like 2015 era Elasticsearch of static clusters that are so difficult to manage and have noisy neighbor problems and hotspots. I would say that era of Elasticsearch was a terrible idea. It was just clearly a terrible idea, but it solved some quick problems for fast-moving startups, and so they used it anyway. And then we all ended up bearing the cost. I think it's different to Kafka. Like you can, yes, I'd say Elastic's 2015 era static cluster Elasticsearch. I think that's the one I've just seen cause so much pain. I don't want to say for so little gain, but like you could take Lucene and build your own thing, and it wasn't that hard. Like it was never clear to me why anyone loved Elasticsearch.
Just blow it out of the off the map, and it'll pull 5 years of progress forward because we'll fix the problem.
Exactly. You build it to horizontally scale from day one rather than treating it as an afterthought. Like that was, it was sort of crazy in hindsight.
A plus. Well, when we get our time machine, I'll let you know. What's the most ridiculous bug you've seen in the Husky migration outside of in your whole career?
Ridiculous or like painful? Like the worst one. So this is back to my Nitro. So Nitro was the reimplementation of EC2's data pipeline. So the first version. It became the whole hypervisor. And so it was a literally bits to bytes conversion, a divide by 8 that had been left off by our strongest engineer who had left though like a year ago. And it turned out to be like it was on an ICMP reply. So you get a packet into the data pipeline, and you basically have to send back an ICMP, maybe too big, and you have to like offset into the source packet on like the port or whatever. And this was like like 2 characters, divide by 8. So a tiny bug by like the strongest engineer I've ever seen, but he was sitting there, and no customer had hit it until it was hitting one customer at scale, and this like 2-character bug ended us taking about 3 developer months to ship because we had to be so careful about understanding did this impact any customer other than the one who's reported it to us was a massive endeavor. And so like I'd say it was just ridiculous in terms of the number of characters to the amount of man months it took. And yeah, it always, it was classic. The code did not have unit tests. So it's a classic, this is why you unit test and not just integration test. But yeah, just the one where the pain was so deep and to solve. And essentially it took my strongest engineer 3 months to fix a 2-character bug.
That's horrible. That's the smile of someone who experienced incredible pain a decade ago.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in hindsight, it's all lessons. At the time, it was absolutely awful. Love it. A complete diversion from what we wanted to be doing.
Cool. And last one, if folks want to follow up, where can they find you on the internet?
So I think the easiest, so Junction Labs has a blog, so I think it's junctionlabs.io is probably the easiest place. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn, but it's just, I'm one of the only 2 Ian Nolands on LinkedIn, and I'm the only one with long hair at this point in my life, so easy to find on LinkedIn.
Right on. All right, we'll drop links to that. Thanks so much for being on.
Excellent. Thank you for having me.